Okay, right. Can I welcome all of you very warmly to the new club and to the Waterscott Club. Thank you very much for coming in this baking hot weather. As members of the club know, we've had a tradition for several years of having a symposium in the summer looking at the novel which was published 200 years before. And the novel which we're looking at this morning is obviously Peveril of the Peak and published in 1822. And of course we're very close to Waterscott's birthday. Now our two speakers to introduce the novel to us are Professor Alison Lumsden and Professor Catherine Jones. They are both from the University of Aberdeen, and we were all colleagues in Aberdeen 20 plus years ago. However, I mean, it is actually extremely nice for me to welcome them both. They're both very good friends, and I greatly appreciate their work. Now, what I'm going to do is give you, for the sake of the video, a brief biography of each, and then I'll ask Alison Lumsden if she would give her presentation. So Professor Alison Lumsden is a graduate of the Universities of Aberdeen and Edinburgh, and she worked at the University of Aberdeen as an AHRB Research Fellow for the Edinburgh edition of the Wavelength Novels before taking up an appointment as a lecturer. And she was appointed senior lecturer in 2006 and to a chair in 2012. And she's now a general editor of the Edinburgh edition, and she's the lead editor for the edition of Waterscott Poetry. She's co-director of the University of Aberdeen Waterscott Research Centre, which has brought in a lot of money and is doing research on all aspects of Scott's life and work. Ali has written very extensively indeed on the work of Waterscott and on other aspects of Scottish literature, including Nan Shepherd and Lewis Creswick Gibbon. She was president of the Association for Scottish Literary Studies 2015 to 19, and she's currently the honorary librarian for Waterscott's library at Abbotsford and a trustee of Abbotsford. And she's now the Regis Professor of English Literature in Aberdeen. And the first volume of the poetry, which is Balmain, came out in 2018. So Ali, of course, has been president of the club, and we've seen you many times, and very good to see you back. I'm going to introduce Catherine too, if that's all right, and then we can let you go one after another. Professor Catherine Jones studied English at Cambridge at Emmanuel College, where she did both her BA and her PhD. She then taught British and American literature at the National University of Ireland in Galway. She moved then to Aberdeen in the year 2000 and became senior lecturer and was promoted to a personal chair. She's been director of research for the School of Language, Literature, Music and Visual Culture. She's held various visiting chairs and appointments in different places, including the College of William and Mary, in Leiden. She's had a Leverkusen fellowship and a Kunstkamera fellowship, and she's past president of the 18th Century Scottish Studies Society, and she is an expert on 18th century and the Romantic period. And Catherine, very good to see you. And so could I ask Ali if she would come and give her presentation?
Thank you, Iain, and thank you so much for inviting us here today. Very close to Scott's birthday, so it's very nice to be celebrating this. I should say that we now have 2 volumes of the poems out, and Peter and Julian Hughes' very excellent volume on the shorter poems, and we have another few coming out imminently, so watch this space. I'd also like to say that Abbotsford has asked me to bring some newsletters and forms if you want to apply to become a friend of Abbotsford. I have a feeling many of you are already, but there are some forms out there just for anybody who's interested. But more importantly, the Abbotsford newsletter telling you what we're up to at the moment. So to turn to Peveril of the Peak. Peveril of the Peak is by far Scott's longest novel, and many would argue that it's his least successful. Many readers share with its fictional editor, the Reverend Dryasdust, a sense of being a little exhausted towards the end of the 2nd volume. Prince Albert, in fact, died while he was reading Peveril of the Peak, and a copy is preserved in the Royal Collection. A black edging reveals that he gave up the ghost even earlier than Dryasdust. Queen Victoria had apparently reached chapter 5 of volume 1 before Albert gave up the will to live. So while some critics maintain that it's good in parts, few argue that it's worth a second read. D.W. Jefferson, for example, describes Peveril as a long and cumbersome work with a shapeless plot, and concludes that the one scene that is worth reading, the scene where Alice Bridgenorth is rescued from Chiffinches, is really wasted because nobody gets that far in the book. Now, a few recent critics have tried to redeem it: Graham McMaster, Fiona Robertson and Catherine. Most remain in step with contemporary responses. Sidney Smith of the Edinburgh Review, for example, writes to Archibald Constable thanking him for his complimentary copy. A good novel, he writes, but not so good as either of the 2 last, and not good enough for such a writer. The next must be better, or it will be the last. Even Scott's great apologist, J.G. Lockhart, is forced to conclude that its reception was somewhat colder than that of its 3 immediate predecessors. Fenella was an unfortunate conception. What is good in it is not original, and the rest extravagantly absurd and incredible. The story is clumsy and perplexed, the catastrophe foreseen from the beginning, and yet most inartificially brought about. Sorry, I can't say that for some reason. It's of course common to account for the perceived failure of Peveril of the Peak by regarding it as a symptom of the overproduction and money spinning which many see as characteristic of Scott's literary production in the 1820s. So it was written in 1822, and that's a year in which 3 novels by the great unknown ostensibly appeared: The Pirate, The Fortunes of Nigel and Peveril itself. Actually, in spite of the dates on the title pages, The Pirate was in fact published right at the end of 1821 and Peveril at the end of 1823, partly because it got stuck on the ice in the Thames and couldn't make its way into London. So it's right at the beginning of 1823 it's actually published. But nevertheless, this year was one of the phenomenal output of the author. Scott's publishers, Constable and Company, had a contract with the great unknown for 5 novels from The Pirate, and they were really anxious that their golden goose, as they called him, should continue to lay golden eggs, preferably as swiftly as possible. Their enthusiasm isn't in the least bit surprising, because 10,000 copies was by now the standard print run for a Waverley novel, and this had had to be increased for The Pirate to 12,000 because of advanced orders. 7,000 copies of The Fortunes of Nigel had been sold by 10:30 on the day of its publication, 10:30 a.m. And while Constable urges that they should be cautious about printing too many copies of Peveril, he still reckons they need about 10,500. There are ways then in which the perceived inadequacies of Peveril may be justifiably seen as a consequence of the pressures placed upon Scott to feed a hungry market for his novels and a publisher equally hungry to maximise his profits. Scott also points to personal tragedy as a reason for the inadequacies of the novel. On the 14th of August, during the King's visit, Scott was to lose what Lockhart calls his dearest friend, William Erskine, Lord Canada. Erskine was Sheriff Depute for Orkney, among other things, and had only the year before supplied Scott with materials for The Pirate. Erskine's death was under something of a cloud and has seriously depressed Scott, and in a letter of 28th October, just as a fourth volume of Peveril was being first mooted, he describes himself as damnably out of spirits. Certainly, it is the depression caused by Erskine's death that for Scott accounts for Peveril's weaknesses. He writes, "The depression of my own spirits, arising from poor Lord Kinnair's death, and a sort of thickness of the blood, has infested this same Peveril. But the next will be a rally, at least I hope so." So there are then reasons enough to justify why Peveril of the Peak may not be among the finest of Scott's creations. Overproduction on the one hand and personal circumstances on the other both took their toll on Scott as the novel was being written. However, and you knew there was a however, as you might expect, after spending several years editing this novel, I would like to make a case that this is all, it's all much more interesting than all of this implies. I think I've probably read Peveril more times than anybody else ever has, and possibly more than is good for my health. But as a result of that, it's impossible on the one hand not to grow fond of it, and on the other, to begin to wonder if the very absurdities, incredulities and clumsiness which Lockhart identifies in this text may be symptomatic not of a kind of emerging redundancy in Scott's writing, or the next will be the last, but rather, as Graham McMaster has suggested, of an altogether more intellectually interesting anxiety or perplexity about the novel form itself, which evolves as Scott explores the potential of historical fiction. In other words, I'd like to propose that the artificiality which so many critics have identified may in fact be part of Peveril's very meaning. So published in the early 1820s, Peveril is of course one of the novels written in an increased period of self-reflexivity in Scott's career, the period of preface writing, which includes Ivanhoe and the Fortunes of Nigel, and which provides a commentary that gives us insight into Scott's theories on the historical novel as a form. The much-quoted introductory epistle to Nigel has a tendency to overshadow Peveril's prefatory letter, but Peveril's introductory chapter also has much to tell us about Scott's anxieties about his craft, and of course about the particular anxieties which inform the narrative which follows. Part of this debate, as I'm sure you all know, lies in the relationship between the historical record and historical fiction, with Scott increasingly justifying the fact that the historical novel offers a different kind of truth from that contained in historiography as it was shaped along standard Enlightenment models. As Dryas Dust peruses the manuscript, which has ostensibly been sent to him by the author of Waverley, he observes, "Here are figures enough to confuse the march of a whole history, anachronisms enough to overset all chronology," signalling the specific anxieties which go on to haunt Peveril. The anachronistic appearance of the Countess of Derby is a particular gripe, both by Dryas Dust and other people. In his defence, the author of Waverley responds that he is in fact constructing an altogether more complex relationship between fact and fiction. He doesn't attempt to offer true history, but rather ransacks its narratives, lights on striking circumstances, and bedizens them with imagination to provide lively fictitious pictures. If doing so refers readers to more serious research, as he suggests, well, that's good. If not, must one, he asks, swear to the truth of a song? He's suggesting then that it's an altogether different kind of truth that he's trying to convey to his reader, a knowledge, as he puts it, not perhaps of the most accurate kind, but such as he might not otherwise have acquired. Now, it's easy to read all of this as a bit of fun, by 1822 simply part and parcel of the jokes and subtexts which accompanied a Waverley novel. The letter does, of course, contain the seeds of a serious debate on the nature and purpose of a historical novel, and alerts us to the fact that the narrative of Peveril may contain similar explorations. We should then be at least willing to consider if the contrived nature of Peveril and its overt artificiality, its divergence from historical verisimilitude, may indeed be part of its meaning. And while I would argue that this is symptomatic of Scott's more general self-reflexivity and theorising of the historical novel form in the 1820s, there are perhaps also more specific reasons for this appearance in a heightened form in Peveril, the Restoration setting and the Popish plot that lies at the heart of the text. While the main subject of Peveril is the Popish plot of 1678 to 81, the overall time frame of the novel is much longer, with the opening chapter set at the time of the restoration of Charles II and the main action situated 20 years later. The nature of Charles's reign and what it has meant for the kingdom thus underpins the novel, and once Julian arrives in London becomes much more of its focus, with both the King and the Duke of Buckingham central to the action that takes place there. This period was, of course, one that was characterised by secrecy and intrigue, and Buckingham was frequently at the heart of this. He probably didn't have as much of a role in the Popish plot as the novel implies, but it certainly captures the kind of intrigue he was involved with throughout his life. Buckingham, George Villiers, was also, of course, a writer himself, and his career underwent something of a revival at the time of the Popish plot. Now, Scott's knowledge of the Restoration period was wide-ranging. By the time he was writing Peveril, he had edited Somers' Tracts, which contain extensive accounts of this period, and he'd also produced his edition of Dryden. He was also more than familiar with the drama of the period, not least Buckingham's own The Rehearsal, which Scott quotes from multiple times in his journal and letters. Interestingly, as Cedric Gale has pointed out, what characterises the heroic dramas of the day, including The Rehearsal, are characters caught up in extravagant situation and torn by conflicts of love and honour, expressed in language far above nature and far beyond sense. This, we might note, could also be a criticism levelled at Peveril. Moreover, to some extent, Buckingham draws attention to this and attacks it in The Rehearsal, demanding some reason, not all rhyme, and a year of prose and sense as opposed to a prodigious way of writing where the new way of wit results in plays without head or tail. Nevertheless, Rosenbardo has pointed out that in spite of his appeal for clarity, the dangerous nature of the times meant that often Buckingham himself had to write in an artificial way, or via a kind of double-coded language, to the extent, of course, that keys have to be provided for later readers so that they can understand the extent to which the political attack he is making takes place in his plays. Zimbardo also draws attention to the fact that, perhaps because of the fraught political circumstances in which it's written, Restoration drama is seldom mimetic in its impulses, but essentially performative. Much of it, she suggests, is concerned with self-artifice, an argument supported, for example, by the number of plays within plays in the drama of the day, and by a repeated concern with the topic of man, the image maker. She concludes that in much of the drama, surface realism thus only is a satiric device, for it's underpinned by an understanding that to be a human being is to be a player and a shaper of scenes. If we read the novel with this in mind, it's not hard to argue that the much lamented artificiality of Peveril may owe something to its Restoration setting. Saturated as he is in the period while writing, Scott may also be exploring, consciously or otherwise, the relationship between performance and reality, or to put it another way, the relationship between the kind of truth revealed by song or art more generally, and the essential truths of the historical record. Certainly, this would account for the fact that while the overall plot may be tortuous or even preposterous, there are many memorable and powerful scenes in Peveril. Not only Alice at Chiffinch's, which we referred to earlier, but surely also Fenella dancing in the park, the account of Geoffrey Hudson jumping out of a pie, the visit to the Tower of London and the death of the keeper, the moment of discovery that Fenella can hear at the end of the novel, or the brooding atmosphere of Julian's departure from Peel Castle, to name only a few of my favourite scenes. When I was thinking about Peveril again for this talk, what I was really struck by was how vividly those scenes live in my imagination. They're almost like memories. And I think that's part of the power of Scotch writing generally, that he creates those very vivid scenes that you can imagine. But there's something about Peveril where the plot maybe you don't remember, but you do remember those vivid scenes. So that kind of may account for it by the Restoration setting, and it also accounts for the staginess of the novel's conclusion, which Charles himself draws attention to. Here is a plot without a drop of blood, and all the elements of a romance without its conclusion. All ends without either hanging or marriage. The events described in the novel then at the conclusion are linked not to mimetic impulses, but to the rules of literature, suggesting that the relationship between the two might actually be part of what is at the heart of the novel. If, however, the Restoration period, or at least its art, is concerned with the ways in which experience is constructed or artificial, then the Popish plot is the most extreme example of this. Perhaps of all the historical events Scott chooses to write about in his fiction, the Popish plot is that which most clearly illustrates the way in which history is shaped by rhetoric, or we might say by narrative or print culture. Roger North, one of Scott's main sources and a major chronicler of the plot, points out that it is indeed nothing but a sham. North elaborates, it may be expected that before we enter upon the subject matter, this term of art, sham plot, should be deciphered. And I love this quote. The word sham is true cant of the Newmarket breed. It is contracted of ashamed. The native signification is of a town lady of diversion in a country maid's clothes, who, to make good her disguise, pretends to be so shamed. But what is this to plots? The noble Captain Dangerfield, being an artist in all sorts of land piracy, I'm going to introduce that into the language, land piracy, translated this word out of the language of his society to a new employment he had taken up of false plotting. And as with them, it ordinarily signifies any false or counterfeit thing so annexed to a plot. It means one that is fictitious and untrue, and being so, applied to it in various writings and sworn depositions, of which we shall have much to observe, is adopted into the English language. Now, North's point is that the Popish plot was one in fact created out of no tangible fact, but almost entirely out of rhetoric. Its intention was simply to generate panic in England and stir up bad feeling against British Catholics and Charles's brother James. As a consequence, as North himself notes, historically the Popish plot was essentially a pamphlet war, constructed out of the power of the printed word. No witness of any kind came in, he said, but his first charge was to print his narrative. Thus went on the trade of narratives till there were above 20, and all of the plot, some with strange, not to say obscene titles not fit to be wrote, and yet appeared in large Gothic capitals upon the title page. In the novel itself, the Earl of Derby draws attention to this. It seems, said the Earl of Derby, that this old England is now gone stark staring mad on the subject of a real or supposed Popish plot. I read one programme on the subject by a fellow called Oates, and thought it the most absurd foolery I ever perused. The nation, like a bull at Tutbury running, is persecuted with so many inflammatory rumours and pestilent pamphlets that she has cocked her tail, flung up her heels, taken the bit between her teeth, and is as furiously unmanageable as in the year 1642. Scott's library at Abbotsford in fact holds over 100 such pestilent pamphlets relating to the Popish plot, with titles such as The Narrative of the Horrid Plot and Conspiracy of the Popish Party against the Life of His Sacred Majesty, the Government and the Protestant Religion, Just Narrative of the Hellish now Counterplot of the Papists to cast the odium of their horrid treasons upon the Presbyterians, A True Narrative of the Horrid Plot and Conspiracy of the Popish Party against the Life of His Sacred Majesty, the Government and the Protestant Religion, Mr. Thomas Dangerfield's particular narrative of the late Popish design to charge those of the Presbyterian party with a pretended conspiracy against His Majesty's person and government. What's really interesting, though, is that while Scott clearly uses more official accounts of the period, such as those by Burnet, Hume, North and Evelyn, as sources for his novel, He also draws extensively on these pamphlets and those he had read when editing Summer's Tracts for details of the story. While a conversation when Julian arrives in Manchester and is buying a horse, which reminds us how easily evidence can be fabricated, is taken from North. From Summer's Tracts, he draws details about Captain Blood. Indeed, some of the most evocative phrases and details in the novel are drawn from the Abbotsford pamphlets. For example, in an early exchange between Topham and Captain Dangerfield, two agents for the plot, Topham states they must put on Protestant spectacles to discover the shadow of a priest or a priest's favourer. Now, the phrase Protestant spectacles is taken from one of the pamphlets when a defender of Titus Oates points out that everybody does not wear his spectacles. An incident when Julian is staying in an inn and it's suggested that a character may be discovered to be a Catholic by requesting fish to be fried in butter rather than suet is taken from the pamphlet A True Narrative and Discovery of Several Very Key Remarkable Passages Relating to the Horrible Popish Plot. The description of Newgate in the novel closely resembles that given by Dangerfield in The Case of Thomas Dangerfield, with some remarkable passages that happened at the trials of Elizabeth Sellier, the Popish midwife. That's the meal tub plot, for those of you who are interested. And the scene where Julian enters the prison and is given a handkerchief from a mysterious female draws on another of Scott's pamphlets for the evocative detail that it may be written upon by invisible ink. And for anybody interested, it tells you how to make the invisible ink. So I could give you many more examples of details taken from these pamphlets, but the point I'm making is that Scott not only is reading these pestilent accounts of a pretend popish plot against Protestant, the whole novel is infused with their spirit. Indeed, the very title of the novel, with its alliteration on P, seems to be inspired by this body of material in the Abbotsford Library. It's worth noting, though, there we go. It's worth noting, though, that as Scott was writing Peveril, another event was, of course, taking place that may also have prompted reflection on the ways in which history is shaped via the narratives we construct around it. In the midst of writing Peveril, Scott was, of course, interrupted by the King's visit, which took place almost exactly 200 years ago this weekend. Scott, as we all know, was only given about 2 weeks to stage manage this event. And we might not all be happy with the legacy this has bequeathed us, and I'm not always sure it's done Scott's reputation much service. But the whole event, interestingly, was an imaginative construction, a hallucination, as Lockhart calls it. The event caused Scott great stress. He was to break out in hives, possibly shingles, just after it. But surely it also made him acutely aware that the stories we choose to construct around historical events will have a profound effect on how they're remembered. Perhaps this sense of hallucination also informs the atmosphere of Peveril of the Peak. As Scott was writing Peveril of the Peak, he seems to have been fascinated by the Popish plot and by the fact that it's an event constructed entirely out of print. It's tempting to speculate that this was particularly appealing to him at a time when he was becoming increasingly reflective about the nature of the historical novel and articulating in his prefaces a growing awareness that its relationship to truth is a complex one, thus, we should note, carrying great responsibility. Peveril has been criticised for 200 years for its artificial nature, for its staginess, for its divergence from the real historical record via its inclusion of the Countess of Derby, for its overtly performative nature, for the contrived nature of its conclusion. What I've been suggesting here, though, is that all of these elements are in fact appropriate for a novel that is set in a period which is obsessed with the idea that we create our own images of ourselves, and which deals with a historical event that is constructed entirely out of narrative. It is, too, appropriate for a moment in Scott's career when he is re-examining the relationship between his own written words and the historical record. Indeed, in its very form, it is reminding us of the constructed nature of narrative, and in particular historical narrative, and to be on our guard about the narratives we read. Peveril of the Peak, read thus, becomes part of a transitional process in Scott's career, and one that was to lead to some of the most overtly self-reflexive novels of his later life. Red Gauntlet, for example, or Chronicles of the Garnegate, and I'm sure we're all glad that we have those and he didn't stop after Peveril. Now, I'm not sure this makes Peveril any better if I read, but if we could get people to read it, Peveril is certainly thus acutely relevant for our own times. As we negotiate our way through social media, fake news and QAnon conspiracies, we do well to remember the lessons of Peveril, that how we understand our own times and those of the past is always mediated through the narratives constructed around them, and we must be alert to pestilent pamphlets, pretend plots and preposterous proposals. Thank you.
Yes, hello, and just picking up from carrying on from Ali here. So Peveril of the Peak is actually one of my favourite Wavelength novels, not least because of its association with the Peveril of the Peak pub on Bridgewater Street in Manchester, shown here from a charcoal and coloured pastel drawn by Peak District artist Claire Allen. I first read Peveril of the Peak when I was working on my PhD thesis at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, on memory in the Wavelength Novels of Scott. And I prepared this presentation actually when I was back at Emmanuel on a visiting fellowship this spring and summer. My topic, Peveril of the Peak and the American historical novel, has some connections to Emmanuel as it concerns the representation of Old and New World Puritans in the work of Scott and his 19th century American contemporaries and successors. Interestingly, around 30 Emmanuel graduates went into exile in North America in the 17th century to avoid persecution from more orthodox religious policy. So to the pestilent pamphlets, pretend plots and preposterous proposals discussed by Ali in relation to Peveril of the Peak, I'd like to add pugnacious Puritans. I'm very grateful to the Edinburgh Scott Club for the opportunity to speak at the Colloquium here today, and also for providing me with an excuse to reread the novel. So Scott has always loomed as an important figure in American literary history. Andrew Hook, in a wide-ranging talk to the club on Scott and America, observed that Scott did much to help the creation of a situation in which American literature could finally come into existence in the face of constant European cultural condescension and disparagement. Fiona Robertson goes so far as to say that Scott's example shaped an entire style of thought, and she writes, Scott's importance for American writers derived in part from a shared inheritance in Scottish Enlightenment culture, in Scottish common sense philosophy, in stadial models of social development, and in Enlightenment historiography. But Americans also responded to specific aspects of his subject matter and artistry. Tales of religious and political division, such as the Tale of Old Mortality, The Heart of Midlothian, and Peveril of the Peak, were directly interpretable in terms of life in the British American colonies. Scott also returned repeatedly to the subject of revolution potent in the new context of the early United States and of the increasingly disunited states of the 19th century. So I'd like today to consider the relationship between Peveril of the Peak and historical fiction set in 17th century colonial America by Irish-American author James McHenry and American author Nathaniel Hawthorne. I'll point to some of the mutually enriching aspects of the transatlantic exchange, influences and affinities, and some of the problems Scott may have cast on American writing, anxieties of influence, questions about authority and cultural authenticity, and the ideological freight of literary genre. So my starting point is the execution of Charles I, King of England, Scotland and Ireland. This evocative document, a flat parchment containing seals and signatures, is handwritten in iron gall ink and led to the execution of Charles I and the subsequent rule of Oliver Cromwell, one of the 59 signatories. Charles, this is well known, was tried in the House of Commons and executed on the 30th of January 1649 outside Banqueting House in Whitehall. Following the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, the death warrant was used to identify the commissioners who had signed it, the regicides, and to prosecute them for treason. Even the signatories who died, including Cromwell, were dug up and their bodies hanged. The House of Lords ordered the return of the death warrant from Charles's executioner, who was imprisoned in the Tower of London. It was returned on the 31st of July, and it's been in the custody of Parliament ever since. Now, shortly before the Restoration, two of the regicides escaped to New England, Cromwell's cousin, Edward Whalley, and Whalley's son-in-law, William Gough. And they were later joined by another regicide, John Dixwell. So although the Puritan colonies in New England paid heed to the requests of London for the capture of Whalley and Gough, their unobtrusive sympathies were with their fellow Puritans. The Puritan colonies of New England were strongly inclined towards the good old cause of Parliament and godly reformation. In his recent book on the regicides in America, Charles I's Killers in America, The Lives and Afterlives of Edward Whalley and William Gough, which I very much recommend. I think it's a great read. Matthew Jenkinson presents a delightful comedy of recalcitrance, of delayed, incompetent or misdirected pursuit of the regicides on the part of the authorities in New England. They really didn't want to catch these regicides. On the run from agents sent to bring them to justice, Whalley and Gough at one point famously hid in the woods of what is now West Rock Ridge State Park. And on the PowerPoint there you can see the rock where they supposedly sheltered, now called Judge's Cave. And they later settled at Hadley in the back country of Massachusetts, where they were visited by Dixwell, their fellow regicide on the run. So Gough's diary fell into the hands of Thomas Hutchinson, the last royal governor of Massachusetts. And it's from a note about the New England regicides in Hutchinson's History of the Colony and Province of Massachusetts Bay that Ezra Stiles, president of Yale College, based his statement in his book on the New England regicides, A History of the Three Judges of King Charles, that Gough had emerged from hiding to assist in the defence of Hadley when it was under attack by King Philip's warriors on the 1st of September 1675, and had coordinated the defence of the town before then disappearing. Now, at first sight, the Angel of Hadley story seems implausible. No Indian attack on the 1st of September 1675 was recorded in the contemporary and extensive account of King Philip's War by the Congregationalist pastor Solomon Stoddard. But as Jenkinson notes, this is not to say that the Angel of Hadley episode never happened, it's just that we might need to redate it. And around 1850, prominent Connecticut artist Frederick A. Chapman pictured the story in the tradition of historical genre painting popular at that time. It's a little bit dark, the image there, but I hope you can see that this painting, The Perils of Our Forefathers, it captures the event, the Hadley event, in highly melodramatic form. Several principal persons are composed in an improbable historical tableau, all huddled closely together in the darkened left side, below Pastor John Russell, standing high in the pulpit. And all of them are looking intently at Gough, who's there. He's the angel with a sword in his right hand, who is urging them by a sweeping gesture with his left hand out of their gloom and into the light against the foe. So how does it all connect to Scott and Peveril of the Peak? Scott became interested in early 1822 in the Angel of Hadley incident. Writing to Archibald Constable on the 25th of February 1822, he agreed with his publisher's earlier suggestion that in good hands Pocahontas would make a capital story, adding, "It might be united with the story of Whalley the regicide, who appeared suddenly when a certain village was attacked by the Indians, rallied the Europeans, fought like a stout old Roundhead as he was, beat off the enemy, and was never again seen." Although Scott concluded the letter by noting that the American author Washington Irving could make something out of the incident, he went on to include the story as an interpolated tale in Peveril of the Peak, told by one of the novel's major characters, the Puritan extremist Major Bridgenorth, And so for those of you that want to read this chapter, it's volume 2, chapter 2. So in Peveril of the Peak, Bridgenorth provides an eyewitness account of the Hadley incident in conversation with Julian Peveril. Bridgenorth describes how the attack on Hadley called forth a tall man of reverend appearance with august features overshadowed by locks of grey hair, which mingled with a long beard of the same colour. And I think he captures very effectively the antiquated speech of Gough. So Gough says, "Men and brethren," he said in a voice like that which turns back the flight, "why sink your hearts, and why are you thus disquieted? Fear ye that the God we serve will give you up to yonder heathen dogs? Follow me, and you shall see this day that there is a captain in Israel." So Scott then goes on to use the technique described by Ivor Winters as the formula of alternative possibilities, when Bridgenorth tells Julian Peveril of the response of the people to the stranger who effected their rescue. The prevailing opinion, Bridgenorth states, was, notwithstanding his own disclamation, that the stranger was really a supernatural being. Others believed him an inspired champion, transported in the body from some distant clime to show us the way to safety. Others again concluded that he was a recluse, who either from motives of piety or other cogent reasons had become a dweller in the wilderness and shunned the face of man. Bridgenorth's own opinion is that the figure was the regicide Wally, and this concludes the story to suggest that the past has a meaning which is accessible. Bridgenorth suggests to Julian that the voice of the regicide may be heard in the field once more, should England need one of her noblest hearts. A view that doesn't contradict, but rather completes the different interpretations held in the formula of alternative possibilities. Now, Peveril of the Peak was introduced to American readers in this Philadelphia reprint edition by Carey and Lee, the largest publishing house in the country. So great was the demand, American demand for Peveril, that the first volume was already reprinted when word arrived from Edinburgh that Scott was adding an extra 4th volume of the text. And the Philadelphia reprint had been set in smaller type, so it would fit into 2 volumes, and Scott's change obliged them to print a 3rd volume. The covers had already been printed with the title reading in 2 volumes, and so a label correcting that had to be added there. You can see it's been stuck on. It's been pasted on to cover the thing saying 2 volumes. Now, the Wavelength Novels offered aspiring American authors with a model for writing the experience of a country of rapidly changing conditions. They also showed how character is conditioned by historical and cultural circumstances, and thus provided a model for the effective fictional depiction of the local. Samuel Taylor Coleridge indicated the transferable power of the Waverley paradigm in a letter to Thomas Alsop of the 8th of April 1820, when he described Scott's subject as the elemental struggle between the 2 great moving principles of social humanity: religious adherence to the past and the ancient, the desire and the admiration of permanence on the one hand, and the passion for increase of knowledge, for truth as the offspring of reason. In short, the mighty instincts of progression and free agency on the other. So this Coleridge saw not specifically a Scottish or even a European, but actually as a human subject, a conflict that underlies all social life and creates the drama in history. So the identification in the American periodical press of appropriately American subject matter and themes for aspiring authors, first Puritan settlements, the Indian Wars, the Revolution and so on, led to a rash of imitations on the Scott model in the 1820s. Peveril of the Peak undoubtedly stands behind Irish-American author James McHenry's romance, The Spectre of the Forest, which entangles the story of Gough with the horrors of the New England witchcraft allegations, trials and executions of the 1690s. MacHenry, we know, was deeply read in Scott's poetry and fiction, and The Spectre of the Forest is indebted in its style and technique to the Waverley novels. For example, here in its use of a rational narrator who provides historical interpretation. Here the narrator is commenting on the New England witchcraft trials in the manner of the Scottish conjectural historian. So just read a little bit of this. He says, "The history of nations never afforded a more extraordinary and melancholy instance of the evils arising from human credulity than that which the colonies of New England exhibited in the absurd and bloody prosecutions for the crime of witchcraft, which agitated and disgraced the country and the species during the years 1692 and 1693. The New Englanders can plead only the liability of the human mind in all climates and under all modifications of society to imposition, error and extravagance. On the other hand, those who would liberally stigmatise and vituperate the New England character for this instance of national frenzy should consider that they themselves possess human failings and prejudices, and that if these, under similar circumstances, were operated upon by the same causes that drove the witch persecutors of 1692 into their inhuman absurdities, they might exhibit a degree of delusion and guilt equally singular and unjustifiable." I'm sure you can all think of examples from the Waverley novels of similar kinds of commentary on enthusiasm, extremism, that kind of thing in the Waverley novels. So MacHenry transfers the sphere of Goth's movements from Hadley to the Valley of the Housatonic, while continuing the Deus Ex Machina role. The plot's extraordinarily complicated, featuring, in the words of American reviewer W.H. Channing, wars, Indians, wild beasts, witches, trials, hangings, mobs, pirates, regicides, all conspiring against the reader's peace in every page. In the extract on the PowerPoint, Gough, dressed as a spectre, appears in order to effect the release of the novel's hero, George Parnell, and one Amos Settle, who've been imprisoned for rashly demonstrating their support of those accused of witchcraft. "You have been too rash, men and Christians," he exclaims. "Your zeal has been without knowledge and has led you into crime." So MacHenry turns the Hadley rescue of the interpolated tale in Peveril of the Peak into a plea for religious tolerance. You may recall that in Peveril of the Peak, Bridgenorth suggested to Julian Peveril that the regicide Wally might emerge again from the American shadows, should England need one of her noblest hearts. In MacHenry's novel, Gough, from his position of exile in America, repairs his relationship to England by keeping his friends amongst the British nobility informed of the witch business in New England. So he's no longer simply a fugitive, protected from a vengeful king by rebellious New World colonists. He now spies on the New England colonies for the joint monarchs William and Mary, eventually winning a pardon from them. So thus the witchcraft episode drives Gough away from the intolerance of the American colonists and back into the favour of the throne. So is The Spectre of the Forest an American novel? Channing certainly had his doubts, complaining that in works such as MacHenry's, the art of writing an American novel is neither more nor less than the art of describing under American names such scenes as are in no respect American, peopling them with adventurers from all quarters of the globe, except America, with a native or two here and there. Now, James Fenimore Cooper explored the problem of creating a national literary tradition for the new American Republic through an aesthetics imitation in his Gleanings in Europe, England. And he took particular aim at Scott, saying that the bias of Scott's feelings, is deference to hereditary rank. This idea pervades his writings not in professions, but in the deep, insinuating current of feeling. And that if Sir Scott may be right, but if he's right, our system, Cooper says, is radically wrong. And one of the first duties of a political scheme is to protect itself. Ironically, of course, Cooper's own reputation as the American Scot was founded on his adoption of the Waverley models in the Leatherstocking Tales, and his use of Scott's representation of the Highlands and Highlanders as models for the wilderness of the American frontier and for American Indians. Yet Cooper consciously deviated from Scott in one particular, especially important to the history of the novel in America, his presentation of the relationship between the authority of written and oral narrative and the cultural status of books. The book, as a mark of civilised culture, Fiona Robertson notes, retains its status in 19th century British American fiction, but is an object of a more fundamental unease in the most self-consciously American writers of the same period. So American fiction's valorizations of the truth and immediacy of oral testimony gather force in Cooper's Leatherstocking Tales above all, but also in such works as his As the Wept of Wish Ton Wish, which features the regicide Goth as a character called Submission, who shows a Connecticut River Valley community of Wish Ton Wish how to repel attacks from Indian warriors. So the last example is, I want to just mention briefly, is Hawthorne's short story, The Grey Champion, which is the most famous American use, I think, of the story of the regicides in America. And the title actually recalls Bridgenorth's account in Peveril of the Peak of the attack on Hadley as calling forth this grey figure. Hawthorne's story focuses on the reign of James II and the administration of Sir Edmund Andros, governor of the Dominion of New England between 1686 and 1689. James II had created the Dominion of New England in 1686 in order to tighten control over the administrative affairs of the New England colonies and had appointed Andros as a governor. So Hawthorne notes that Andros's administration lacked scarcely a single characteristic of tyranny, and the grounds for justified rebellion is established, and there's great excitement amongst the people described in Hawthorne's tale when rumours spread that William of Orange is preparing to overthrow James II. So then suddenly the ancient man, and the figure of an ancient man appears, who seems to have emerged from among the people and was walking by himself along the centre of the street to confront the armed band. He's wearing the old Puritan dress, and he announces James II's abdication and foretells the overthrow of Andros. The Andros then, overawed by the Grey Champion, he orders his soldiers to withdraw, and the following day the governor is made prisoner and William of Orange proclaimed king. Hawthorne concludes his story with the formula of alternative possibilities used by Scott in Peveril of the Peak. But where was the Grey Champion? Some reported that when the troops had gone from King Street and the people were thronging tumultuously in their rear, Bradstreet, the aged governor, actually an alumnus of Emmanuel College and had been selected by the colonists to be their governor by the colonists, so Bradstreet was seen to embrace a form more aged than his own. Others soberly affirmed that while they marvelled at the venerable grandeur of his aspect, the old man had faded from their eyes, melting slowly into the hues of twilight, till where he stood there was an empty space. But all agreed that the hoary shape was gone. So where Scott resolves the alternative possibilities related by Bridgenorth into firm recognition, Hawthorne leaves in doubt the question of the identity of the Grey Champion. He says, perhaps his name might be found in the records of that stern court of justice, which passed a sentence too mighty for the age, but glorious in all after times, for its humbling lesson to the monarch and its high example to the subject. So the crucial point here is that might belongs to the realm of speculation rather than to history or memory, and the tale then moves into abstraction. So the Grey Champion is said to have appeared at significant points leading to the American Revolution. He's a type of New England's hereditary spirit. So American historical novelists of the 19th century constantly questioned and reconfigured Scott's approach and style. In The Grey Champion, we can see how creating a national literary tradition for America would involve Hawthorne in a different relationship to the past to that adopted by Scott in the Wavelength Novels. Expanding historical writing into American scenes and contexts would also mean the development of a sparer and more concentrated American style, honed by Hawthorne in both his short stories, such as The Grey Champion, and his longer historical romances. Thank you.
Thank you both. So thank you both for really terrific talks. I'm a person who's read Peveril the Peak once, but you've certainly encouraged me to read it again. And as a person who's actually always worried about the Popish plot and the threat of something which has been conjured out of the air, I was really fascinated by the way you linked this to the New Salem witch trials and another unreality cultured from nowhere, and the virtue of tolerance which this perhaps might teach us. We're actually running slightly. Is that all right? Yeah. Okay. There is some time for questions. Yes.
Fascinating talks, both of them. Picking up on the American novel, there is actually an influence of Scott on, I think, the greatest American historical novelist of the latter part of the 20th century, Gore Vidal, who oddly enough said Peveril of the Peak was his favourite Scott novel. Possibly he was being, in his usual, contrarian self, but I don't think he was when he said that his greatest influence in being a historical novelist was Sir Walter Scott. So I think that's a continuing theme. On the subject of the influences of Scott on the Peveril, I had been reading more recently David Hume's history of this period, and I've been struck rereading Peveril at the influence of Hume on Scott, particularly taking, well, obviously we know his views on religious enthusiasm, but to take a particular example, his view of Charles II, who usually gets a good press from novelists, particularly in the Romantic after Worcester period, but here Hume's view of Charles, that he had the ability and the lack of religious fanaticism that his father lacked, but he didn't apply himself. He was lazy and incorrigible and decadent. And I think that's quite an interesting that whole account. And the Popish plot, perhaps this is a bit speculative, the whole influence which Hume brings out of the hysteria of the crowd, you could perhaps postulate that Scott's description of the hysteria of the mob for the Porteous riot perhaps has some connection to that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and he's certainly influenced a lot by Hume.
Yes.
When he's writing the novel.
Yes.
And I think that criticism of Charles is really interesting because one of the scenes I alluded to when we go to the tower and you know, that's one of the most poignant scenes of Charles being taken to task.
Yes, well,
so clearly there.
He's very critical of Charles in his history.
One at the back, and can I come to you?
I should confess, this is one that was not on the syllabus. And that's the salutary effect of the presenting, which is astonishing because at the time when Scott was doing multiple things in that year, since the time of Henry VIII, you had a ferocious couple of centuries of intolerance. And so in brief, when set with the topic to my favourite wiki, I've got 10 pages both on Peveril of the Peak and the Popish plot. And the interesting bit at the tail end, not to go on, is simply at that time, there's lots of things happening in England and Europe and democracy-wise. Only in 1829 was there the Roman Catholic Relief Act of 1829. So today we've got so many correctnesses and puritanical streets and all the rest. That's nothing to what our tales of our grandfather had, as far as I can see. So I think I'll be raiding the West Port for one or two interesting texts in consequence of. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your lectures. And one thing that I was stimulated by, one of the things anyway, is that I think that we're too willing to single out Walter Scott novels for criticism. And I'm not quite sure why we do that, really, because if you look at enthusiasts of most great novelists, that I think that by and large they're supportive. And as far as Peveril is concerned, that I reread it for this and once more adored the book. And I think that there are criticisms of the plot being in some respects contorted, but I've always felt, who cares about the plot? That I'm more interested in the enjoyment of reading chapters. And what you can see particularly in Walter Scott's work is the development of a theme gradually, and he's finding the theme in a sort of voce introduction, and you could say that there are, you know, if you want, largos and crescendos and all the rest of it, and the way that he handles, I mean, in, for example, chapters 30 and 31, the way that he handles the build-up to dramas, and then the way he executes the dramas is, I think, stunning. And, you know, I think we should perhaps recognise that.
Sometimes I think it's partly to do with novelists that write an awful lot. I mean, Fenimore Cooper is another one that people will sort of say, goodness me, this one isn't very good, or, you know, this one's great, but this one's terrible. But then you have that, then a different example would be someone like Henry James, who's also written a lot, and the Henry James Society, they think they sort of would say every novel's marvellous. So I suppose there it becomes to do with questions about the aesthetics of the novel, that in Henry James is so carefully crafted, beautiful constructions, and then from looking at that perspective backwards onto Scott, people can kind of say, well, this one isn't really very good. But I think you're absolutely right. I think that we need not to do that. We need to look at each one, you know, on their own terms and enjoy them in different ways.
Louise?
Yes, I just wanted to support what you've just said, and that is, I think it depends what you read a book for as well. I mean, when I read Walter Scott, I don't read him for the plot, because I think the plot is quite often quite weak. But I read him because I enjoy the world he creates. And while I'm reading it, I'm in that world, and he does that very well. And I mean, I'm just thinking of The Pirate, for example. I mean, it's all totally unbelievable, but it doesn't worry me. Because, I mean, for believability, I've got history, and I've got my own life, and there is plenty else, but the scenery he creates is just wonderful, I think, and that's what I read him for.
And I think that's part of the point he's making in Peveril, is,
Yes.
you know, and I really was struck when I was thinking about it again, when I started thinking about Peveril and thinking about the scenes that I like. I could have gone on and on, because there's so many vivid scenes. And actually they feel almost like memories I have, you know, and that's how vividly Scott writes. Yes. I do kind of worry that, you know, at some point I'll start muttering away as if I actually had inhabited every Scott novel, which would be a bit, yeah, you know, start speaking about when I was out in the 45 or something. But, you know, I do think those scenes resonate in your mind, and the plots aren't the point, you know, but and the other thing that's not really the point, and I think Scott suffers from, is the sort of psychological motivations of the characters, which is how somebody like Henry James teaches us to read the novel, and people have forgotten that that's not why you read Scott. You read it for other purposes, and actually, you know, this is Scotland's new storytelling. You know, Scott's so brilliant as a storyteller.
Peter, did you want to say something?
Not a question. You've invited me to give the vote of thanks. So
Oh.
I'm primed up for that.
I'm very glad to know. Does anyone else want to ask anything? Well, Peter.
Well, as people here know, this is the latest in a sequence of bicentenary colloquiums celebrating Scott's major works, and before the session started, I was thinking of the start being the obvious bicentenary of Waverley in 2014, which I did with Claire Lamont. But Ali stood up, and I suddenly went back further in time to 2010, when you were one of the speakers celebrating the Lady of the Lake, and we went to Loch Katrine. I don't know if anybody here remembers that. But as you reminded me, I haven't counted the words myself, but you're well qualified to tell us that it's the longest Scottish novel. And when we were working together on the Edinburgh edition, I thought David Hewitt might land it at my door, you know, on the pretext, the false pretext that I come from Derbyshire. It didn't, it went into abler hands. And what a good job you did. I've been looking at the mighty tome again, Ali, and you did a magnificent job on it. The historical note, for instance, is a most wonderful piece of scholarship there. I can't say I've reread it. I have looked at snippets, and it reminds me particularly that a lot of the things there must have been so new in Scott's own time. The historical setting, putting the characters in a historical setting, it's become a cliche almost in the historical novel. It was new, nobody had done it quite like that before. The reuse of the picaresque, 18th century picaresque novel on that trip down to London, I remember. And then the presentation of Charles's court, or is it his bordello, and the presentation of a monarch. And there was one just in the coming up the Firth of Forth at that point. Well, it was on today, 13th of August, 1822. Our fat friend was coming up the Forth, you know. But to present a monarch in such human terms, that too, again, it's become a Hollywood cliche in some respects, but it was new at the time. And you remind us of all that. You also remind us very well of the interconnectedness of this novel with Restoration drama and the pamphlet wars of this period. And I think you quite correctly and interestingly drew a parallel with our own world of false fake news and Twitter and so on, and how we might negotiate ourselves through all these fibs and lies and vested interests and remain relatively sane. I'm sure Scott is talking about that among other things. Catherine, you presented us with a new dimension. It was new to me. I remember reading a novel about the regicides in America and the pursuit of them. I don't think it was Major Bridgeworth's anecdote. I can't remember that at all at the moment, quite frankly. It might have been Hawthorne, it might have been MacHenry, it might have been Fenimore Cooper, or it might have been a more modern novel that I got into my hands. But I think you offers an entirely new perspective, really. It was for me the way that Scott, in specific and general terms, fed into American narrative in the form of fiction, and it was most interesting. I don't know whether you contrived this between you, but a sort of, dare I say it, Ali, it was a brilliant general approach, and then we got a new perspective. And there was a real dynamic in the two approaches together, I thought, today, and we as a club much appreciate your input in that respect. Thank you.
Peter, thank you. Thank you. Thank you both. I've just got over COVID and my voice has become that. Although I am definitely negative. And as you know, there is a visit to Holyrood House tomorrow at
Monday.
Sorry?
Monday.
I'm so sorry, Monday, yes, at 3:45. Yes. And then some of us, I hope, are coming to the dinner later in the week, which is here. Thank you again, and I hope that there are sandwiches or something outside. So please go have something to eat.